Well, hey there, and welcome back. So this week we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of me doing all the talking, I've actually brought on a friend and a guest who's going to do all of that for us. So today we've got Timothy Brookins from Houston in Texas in the USA. But Tim, just before we start, just quickly tell us a bit about yourself and who are you? What's your sort of story there?
So I currently teach a university called University of St. Thomas, and teach jointly with their seminary, St. Mary's Seminary here in Houston. So the Catholic university, I've been in Houston for about 15 years. I had taught at another university here called Houston Baptist University, now called Houston Christian University, for 13 years prior to coming to my current post. And here we are. And I've gotten to know this really cool guy in the field named Dr. Adam White. So,
Great to see. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. Actually, so the main reason I wanted to chat to you, just actually more about your latest book, which we'll get to sort of towards the end of the discussion. Your main area of interest is sort of the intersection of early Christianity and philosophy as the two basic subsets. Obviously, there's variations within that. And that's been an area of interest of mine as well. And anyone who listens to the show knows that I tend to sort of delve into that realm. But I thought I'll get somebody on who really actually knows what he's talking about, and sort of go into a little bit more depth, particularly around the topic of Stoicism. But we'll get to your book. But this is about your fifth or sixth book. I was just trying to think this morning. How many books are you up to now?
Well, my seventh just came out this week.
Seven. Okay. I've miscounted.
Greek. In fact, I've got it right here because it came out yesterday. Greek and Roman philosophy.
Fantastic.
An introduction for students of the New Testament.
That's the one I read a little bit of in the lead up.
And the one we're talking about today, I presume,
Brilliant.
Is this one. Rediscovering the wisdom of the Corinthians. Yeah. And that one is my sixth.
Brilliant. So what are the ones prior to that? Where have you sort of come from?
Yeah, my dissertation published in 2014 was also about the background of 1 Corinthians. I wrote a commentary on the Greek text of 1 Corinthians in 2 volumes.
Mm-hmm. So does that count as 3 or 2? You count that as the 3? Because I would.
You count it
as in 3 books?
No, well, I counted it as 2. Yeah, it was, but it was 165,000 words, so it was.
Yeah, it was a lot. I've got both volumes on the shelf, and it takes up like half the bookshelf of thickness. But anyway, yes, okay. So that's 2. So So what are the other ones?
Yeah, occasionally you're getting a little bit fuzzy for me, but I think that I'm still following everything that's happening.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. And so I have a shorter commentary on 1 Corinthians that came out in 2020. A mid-level, kind of student-level commentary on the Thessalonian letters that came out in 21. And a book called Ancient Rhetoric and the Style of Paul's Letters. It's kind of a reference tool that evaluates Paul's Greek according to the standards of ancient rhetorical theory about how one spoke eloquently. Followed by the 2 books that we just talked about, including the Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians book that we'll be talking about.
So there's an obvious overlap between the 2 recent books. The one on philosophy is, as you say, it's more of a student guide to just the ancient philosophical schools, whereas the Corinthians book is much more of a monograph specifically on Corinthians 1 to 4.
That's right. Yeah, the monograph Rediscovering is highly technical. We can talk about it in a way that makes sense to everyone, but it's a highly technical book that is really written for specialists in the field. Whereas the newer book on Greek and Roman philosophy, I will say, it's when I wrote it, I had in mind kind of specialists in the field that weren't strong in the area of Greek and Roman philosophy, right? So people that have studied the Bible, the New Testament, early Christianity, but don't know a lot about the philosophical component of the intellectual culture or just the culture of the Greco-Roman world more broadly. So it is a little bit more technical, but it doesn't use any Greek text in it. right?
Hmm.
Any Greek words are transliterated into English characters, and it's a little bit shorter. It's about half the length of the previous book too.
What
So
I
yeah, again,
liked when
maybe
I
say
read, sorry, I
yeah.
was
So
going to say,
it's maybe you describe it as kind of a mid-level book too, sort of a student level, or somebody that's a serious student of the Greco-Roman world and early
that's
Christianity.
great. We'll talk about that book first, actually, because I think that's going to be a great foundation for your second book. What I liked, the parts that I read a few of the chapters earlier on, and what I did like about it is that you just gave a basic foundational history of the different schools. Just a bit of Zeno's background, the founder of Stoicism, and just a general introduction to who the people were, what the cultural context of why they came about, where their thinking came from. So I think that's really important. Actually, maybe we can start there. Just to talk a little bit about philosophy in general. And I think when I talk to students, anyone really, it's just not something they conceive of as being a factor at all in the world, in Christianity, certainly in the New Testament. We think about modern philosophy and it's very, very abstract ideas that you talk about in universities. And what does that have to do with my
Hmm.
Christian faith? Whereas in Paul's world, they were synonymous. There was so much overlap to and people that would look at the Christians or look at a teacher like Paul and say, well, you're clearly a philosopher.
Hmm.
I always say to my students, when Paul comes to Athens, he doesn't get into an argument with priests. He gets into an argument with Stoics and Epicureans because they resonate with the language, with the way that he speaks. That he looks like a philosopher, and unless you recognize that world or that part of the ancient world, you don't really fully grasp how Christianity was received in that context. So, but just what was philosophy? Start from wherever you think is the most relevant starting point to give it some
Yeah.
context. But yeah, like if you're walking through Paul's world, what is a philosopher?
Yeah, and as you started, I mean, it's probably right about where I would start as well. I think today, when people think of philosophers, they think of kind of philosophy as an armchair exercise, a guy well dressed sitting in his office reading a book and thinking about arguments for or against the existence of God or something like that. And there's some of that in ancient philosophy. If you go back to its origins in the Greek speaking world, prior even to Socrates, we're talking 6th century BC, there were some people that came on the scene that basically said, you know, let's stop and think about some of the things that we think about the world and the way it is and our values and whether we're correct about those things or whether we ought to change our mind about some of them, right? And some of those things included, what we think about the gods. They had poems that enshrined myths about these deities fighting wars and husbands and wives, like Zeus and his wife Hera cheating on each other. And so there were some folks that came along and said, well, if there are gods, is that what the gods were like? I mean, are our poems accurate in talking about these things? The laws that we live by, do we really have to have the laws that we have? If you compare the laws in our city with the laws in someone else's city, the laws are different. So how do we know whose laws are the best or are correct or necessary? What is the basis for law? Is it somehow built into nature, morality, and how things ought to be, or are these things that we've constructed as humans that we can change? And so these basic questions that we would call philosophical questions was the beginning of what would come to be called philosophy, but at that time wasn't quite yet. It's Socrates, of course, a name that most people know, that really became the fountainhead of a major Greek philosophical tradition. And in the spirit of these earlier thinkers, Socrates basically said, you know what? I want to be sure that what I think I know is true. And I want to be sure that the kind of life I'm living is actually the best kind of life. And the only way I'm going to know these things is if I investigate them. And so essentially, he set out on a quest to investigate. And he became very annoying in the process to his fellow citizens in Athens. Essentially, he would look for people who were reputed to be wise. And he would ask them a question that ultimately would stump them and say, what is justice? And they would have a conversation, and he would find holes and flaws in their views until at the end, nobody was quite sure what the answer was to the question. And Socrates' point, though, was to keep searching until he found answers. Because, as you said, I'm not just interested in living, I'm interested in living well. And to live well, I have to know what the good life actually looks like. And so let's explore. And so from Socrates, many of his students founded philosophical schools, which in a way became sort of a family tree of schools. In each generation, they branched off, and some of the schools became very successful and other ones not so much. And that's ultimately what leads to Stoicism about 100 years after the death of Socrates. Stoicism comes along around 300 BC, doing something very similar to what Socrates was doing. They were on a quest to ask, what is the nature of things? And based on the way things are in the universe and what a human being is, what is the best way to live?
That's great. And my very basic understanding is we talk about pre-Socratic philosophers, and then Socrates is really the game changer in that way. What he did is really move the philosophical conversation out of the realms of physics. So the early questions were, what are we made of? What is this world? How do we fit within this cosmos? But what Socrates was really asking was, who am I? What is my place in society? How do I relate to other people? And so it really moved into that realm of ethics that his students followed after, as you mentioned, it's not just about how do I live, but how do I live well? What is the good life? And this pursuit of eudaimonia, this pursuit of happiness and I guess fulfillment, or what's the word we use for it anyway? That sort of idea. And I guess that's where I want to get to in terms of Christianity and even Judaism and other schools of ethical schools like that, where that overlap is. So can you talk a bit more about sort of that move into ethics from starting with Socrates and how that sort of flows through Plato, Aristotle, sort of down into the Stoics, and what are some of the changes and points of difference there?
Yeah. So you alluded to this a moment ago. There was a kind of summary of what Socrates had achieved at this critical point in the history of philosophy, and that is that he brought philosophy from heaven down to earth. Right? In other words, earlier philosophers were busy looking at the heavens, trying to understand them, what was beyond them, whether the stars were deities. And Socrates said, you know what, maybe those things are important, but what's most important to us is how we live our lives. And so that bringing philosophy from heaven down to earth, to everyday life, how we live. In other words, from physics, right, which is the nature of things, to ethics. And it's Socrates who makes that turn in the history of philosophy. And any philosophical school that came along later that claimed to be heirs to a sort of Socratic tradition were trying to do that same thing. They were looking for what the best kind of life is. And what that required them to do is something similar to the earliest philosophers, which was to say, let's stop and question the things that we think we know. So the Stoics, for example, said, we think we know what's good, right? So, I like coming home at night and having a beer at the end of the day, right? That to me, that's a good. Or I want to grow up and be wealthy and someday have a boat, right? I want to be a YouTuber and I want to have, 1 million subscribers, right? And in a way, I think many people would consider those things goods. Some people would consider those sorts of things the highest goods, right? Glory, honor, wealth, reputation, strong body. And what the Stoics did, very much inspired by Socrates, was to say, are you sure those things are the highest goods? And are you even sure that those things are goods at all? And this is where the Stoics were very unique. There was no other philosophical school that took this view, except the Cynics, which are not technically a school. But that's a side point. And so essentially what the Stoics said is there's only one sort of thing that's good, and that's acting virtuously. Virtues are goods. There's only one thing that's bad, and that's acting viciously. right? Committing vices. Nothing else can be considered either good or bad. So they have this third category of things indifferent. So in the category of indifference would be things like my health. They'd say, I'd prefer to be healthy, but I can be perfectly happy and be sick. Right? I'd prefer to have all of my limbs, but if I lost both of my arms, I could still be perfectly happy. Right? I would prefer to have my home, but if it was burnt to the ground, I could still be totally happy. And so essentially the happy life depended on correctly sorting the things that happen to you into the categories of good, bad, and indifferent. And once you correctly identified what something was, if it was a thing that should be considered indifferent, it ought not to affect your happiness whatsoever. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thrown into prison. I lose all of my friends. Who cares? It's indifferent. I still have my virtue. Right? And so what philosophy did, and this was true of Stoicism as well as the other schools contemporary with it, is that it offered a guaranteed path to happiness. And so for the Stoics, they'd say, what's the only way I can guarantee my happiness? It's that if the things that matter are the things that I have total control over, right? Because if losing my home and my family were the sort of thing that could take away from my happiness, then philosophy could no longer guarantee happiness because I can't control whether my house is burnt to the ground or not, right? But within their system, you could control your happiness entirely. If my house burns to the ground, say, that's indifferent. We lose things. I still have the most important things. I have my virtue, right? So Stoicism had a reputation as being very cold, right? But systemically, there's a real coherence to everything they're saying. There's a real consistency to the Stoic outlook. But that's essentially what they were trying to offer, was a path to happiness. And you earlier referred to as eudaimonia, right? That's the Greek word for happiness that Aristotle introduces sometime before the Stoics. And so about that time, 300 BC, the Stoics come on the scene. The school is founded by a guy named Zeno, which I always thought was a good, strong name. If I have another child, I'm going to make a case for Zeno. Yeah, and so the Stoic school under Zeno, in particular under his immediate successors, became really, really successful as a philosophical school. That's why we even know what Stoics are today. There were countless other schools that didn't survive and we know nothing about. But one other school at that time that became pretty successful was the Epicurean school, founded by a guy named Epicurus, again around 300 BC. In those two schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans became the chief rivals. And take just about any philosophical question, and they took opposite views on each of those things. But Epicurus was after the same thing the Stoics were. Can I offer a philosophical system that guarantees happiness if we only live by its principles?
That's an interesting, I'm glad you brought the Epicureans into it. I guess for a New Testament listener, those are two names that they, if they've read Acts, would be familiar with.
Right.
That, again, when Paul's in Athens, he talks to Epicureans and Stoics. So, whether that was Paul literally just happened to run into two Stoic and an Epicurean walk into a bar kind of situation, or whether it was sort of a rhetorical device on Luke's part to say, my listeners know the contrast in schools here, and yet both of them can have this conversation with Paul. Whatever the situation was, he introduces those two schools specifically. He doesn't talk about Peripatetics, doesn't talk about Platonists. Those are the two schools that he identifies. And so, I'm always interested. I've taken students to Mars Hill where that's supposed to have happened, that in Athens where that's supposed to have happened. And, what was going on in that conversation? So that dialogue between Paul and those two schools there, I guess, around the nature of God and salvation and happiness and, the good life. Just could you give us a bit of a, you say that they're almost total opposites. Like, give us some of the highlights between the two schools and where they really sort of oppose each other on those points.
Yeah. So, each school they identified one particular thing that they said is the goal of human life, what they call the telos, sometimes translated as the end of human life, but really just meaning the fulfillment, the perfection, the goal of human life. And for the Stoics, that was what they called life according to nature. There's a lot more to this in terms of Stoic physics, but essentially It involves the idea that there's one God, that God is rational and orderly, that he fills all things in the universe. He fills human beings, which is what gives us the capacity to reason. But it's a sort of divine quality that we have also that's intrinsic to our humanness.
This is the idea of the logos as well, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah. They refer to it as the logos. An idea that some people think that we see the Gospel of John sort of riffing on in the prologue in John chapter 1. So that's where Stoicism begins. So when they say the goal of human life is to live according to nature, what they mean is that we are to live according to this rational, orderly pattern that is guided by this God, where all of the parts of the universe are assigned their own functions, but they all work together for the harmonious good of the whole. So they actually use the body metaphor to describe this, which a lot of people will be familiar with the body metaphor in 1 Corinthians 12, where there's many members but one body and they all need each other. That's sort of the Stoic conception of the universe, right? And so important for the human being is to learn your place in the universe. And so when you see your place in the universe, you resign yourself to it and you say, this is what the universe has designed, therefore it is good. And if it feels bad to me, I need to simply come to terms with the universe has given and recognize that the things I might be calling bad are not even the sorts of things that are bad, right? I might come to a premature death, right? I've become ill and I'm 22 years old and I'm going to die. This is bad. And the Stoic would say, no, it's not. I mean, this is the part that you play in this cosmic whole. And we accept that. And in doing that, we are living according to nature. So what was very different for the Epicureans is that, number one, the gods didn't create everything. The gods didn't create anything. In fact, everything was created by these tiny, invisible, indivisible particles called atoms. And so they got something sort of right? That there are particles that are so small we can't see them that are building blocks of larger things. But that these atoms basically in the beginning were falling through infinite void. And the atoms are all different shapes, sizes, and textures. And when they combine with each other over time and infinite atoms and infinite void, they combine into worlds. And so that's where the world has come from. So the universe, this universe, there's other universes elsewhere in the infinite void, that they were not created and they are accidental, right? You don't have this providential, orderly logos that's looking over things like you have in Stoicism. You have atoms randomly colliding with each other. So that's their physics. When it came to their ethics, the Stoics said, live according to nature, recognize what is good is virtue, everything else is indifferent. The Epicureans said, now actually, from the time that we're born, we have this instinct to pursue things that are pleasurable and to avoid pain. And the Epicureans took from that pleasure must be the highest good. Now, where the Epicureans are usually misunderstood is that they were not for hedonism. They weren't for seeking as much pleasure as you could possibly get. For them, the greatest pleasure was simply not feeling pain. It was the absence of pain. And that's the highest good. So where the Stoic would say virtue is the highest and only good, the Epicurean would say virtue is not good for its own sake. Virtue is only good insofar as it gets you to the more important thing, which is pleasure, right? Because being virtuous is pleasurable.
I think that's an interesting. Sorry, just to cut you off. When you talk about the Epicurean, hedonism or literally happiness is just the absence of pain. It's the absence of suffering, and so let's live a life in Epicurean's garden, and just drink wine, be merry, have friends, and just avoid politics, avoid the world. Just cut yourself off, and all will go well for you. You'll be happy. And that's how you avoid that pain. Therefore, you get happiness. Whereas the Stoic will say, no, pain's part of the predetermined order according to the Logos. And so it's not about avoiding the pain. It's about utilizing that pain to develop virtue. Everything good or bad can be used to develop virtue. So embrace it all as your lot in life. but use it to your own good, whatever that thing might be. Hence, it's indifferent. Pain isn't indifferent. It's just what you want to do. It's not preferred. It's dispreferred, but you can use it for the betterment of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So what all that shows is that, even though philosophy by this time was really about how to live, it did all start with physics, right? That we have an orderly universe, therefore I live this way. Or we live in a world that's randomly created by atoms and in which we instinctively pursue pleasure. Therefore, I should live in a way that's always oriented towards pleasure, right? An important qualification, though, on the Epicurean pursuit of pleasure or avoidance of pain is that some pains are bodily, some pains are mental pains, anguish, in grief and distress. And Epicurus believed that those were actually the more intense pains. And so, again, what philosophy needed to do is to show a way to guarantee your happiness. So, in the Epicurean system, where pleasure is the highest good, and sometimes we get sick, and sometimes things happen to us. Sometimes we have, chronic acute pain. How can I be guaranteed happiness in a system where the end goal is pleasure? And Epicurus said, well, true that we often have acute bodily pain, but when it's acute, it's usually short-lived. And if it's long-lived, it's usually not acute. He said, and besides that, mental pleasures and pains are more intense than bodily pleasures and pains. His argument. I don't know if we all agree with that or not. But he'd say, you're being in a torture chamber, twisted and dismembered. He'd say, if I can find mental pleasure, it will be stronger than the bodily pain that I'm feeling, right? So if I can live in, he said, the memories of being with friends peacefully in a garden with a glass of wine, where we're all trying to help each other become better people, those pleasurable memories are strong enough to overcome the pain that we would prefer to avoid.
That's interesting.
So yeah, the Epicurean system is not the one that I would have chosen had I been there. But I think that there's a lot more sense to it. I think that it's more kind of moderate than it gets credit for.
I always, when I talk about these two schools with my students, maybe it's not the best comparison, but I guess I liken it to a modern debate between sort of a monotheist that has an idea of a determinative God, or a God who sort of determined our fate and we sort of, find our place in whatever God we believe in, versus more of a rational secularist who just simply believes that everything is an atom. When we die, we go back to atoms. There is no God. And so the highest virtue is pleasure. Just this is the only life you've got, whatever the YOLO sort of approach to life, like that, that has sort of that Epicurean tone to it. And one of the misunderstandings, I guess, we talk about the word hedonism and we go, oh, that's all about gluttony and getting as much sensuality as you can to the point where you become desensitized. Like, that's not the Epicurean way. It is, as you say, it's okay, I feel hungry. That's a discomfort. So I eat food, and there's a pleasure of eating food, but only enough to be satiated. If that's the right way to pronounce that word. And then the feeling of just being content. I'm full. I'm not bloated. I'm not hungry anymore. It's just a mental satisfaction that I'm not being bothered by my hunger anymore. And so it's just keeping that sustainable level of just not feeling discomfort. It's actually not about, I'm so happy in this situation. It's just, well, I'm not unhappy. I'm content. And I think we probably have taken that to the extreme sort of in our Western ideas of what we mean by hedonism and happiness, but it's more that reserved idea that Epicurus would promote. Would that be about right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. As you said, just enough. I want just enough pleasure to be absent of pain. And his argument was, okay, you don't feel any pain. How can you intensify zero pain? How can you intensify feeling zero pain? You can't. You can't feel less pain than zero pain. Therefore, your pleasure cannot be any greater than you have at the level of zero pain.
It's true. You mentioned briefly the cynics before, and I just sort of I was fascinated by the cynics. They would have been just a barrel of laughs to watch from a distance, but they would have been terrible people otherwise. But you talk about living according to nature. As far as the Stoics are concerned, that's the cosmic nature. That's the logos, the unseen, determined nature of the universe. Whereas for the cynics, it is a literal live according to nature. If you need to go to the toilet and you're in the middle of the street, just go where you go. Like if you need to relieve yourself in any way, sexually or, bodily, whatever, just do it right there. But the funniest anecdote is, I forgot, you know the source I'm talking about. It's the young guy invites the cynic philosopher over for lunch. And it's this beautiful room. It's adorned by all this wonderful gold patterns around the room and all this sort of thing. And the cynic gets something stuck in his throat. He needs to cough it up, like it's just some phlegm that he needs to get out. And so he coughs it up and he's looking around for a place to spit it. And he looks at the host and he's like, all right, and he spits it in his face. And the host is obviously disgusted. Like, you filthy, why would you do that? And he said, well, when I look around the room, everything's so beautiful. The only thing underadorned is you. So I just had to spit on you. And it's like, that's just so
frostier than,
yeah.
That's a good one.
And it's no wonder. I mean, the name cynic is literally the Greek for a dog. And so they were dogs because that's how they acted. And it's like, all right, wear it with pride. They call us dogs. Yeah. Lean into it. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, they're not so much the point because they definitely don't resonate with Jesus or Paul, but they were definitely an interesting sideshow, I think, in the first century.
Yeah, no, I mean, but since you mentioned that, I mean, there's been a pretty significant line of scholarship over the years that has tried to compare Jesus to the cynics, right? Because the cynics were minimalists, they were often homeless, wandering. They were teachers that challenged kind of conventional values.
Maybe Jesus did spit in one of his host's faces, and the gospel authors just chose to leave that one out of the narrative accounts. We will just never know.
You'll never know. Yeah, yeah. The question is whether there were actually any cynics active in Galilee and Judea when Jesus was active. There's no evidence that there was. So, but superficially, there seem to be some similarities between Jesus and the cynics.
So you've painted a great picture then of what the chief schools were, and certainly what would have been the contemporaries and somewhat rivals of Judaism, Christianity, and those other forms of thought. Bring it into Christianity then, and this is where the comparison really comes to bear. First of all, when you talk about, okay, we've got these philosophers who are getting around and they've got these great lofty ideas about virtue and happiness and pleasure. How does that translate into everyday society? I mean, they've got their students, but there's also a level of popular philosophy where even if you've never studied with a Stoic, you understand Stoic principles just through osmosis. And I guess bringing that into Christianity, where it's one thing to have the idea, but you've got to bring it into the society through the followers. And that's, I guess, where there's a real overlap between Christianity and the philosophical schools. So just talk a bit about the philosophical schools. Like, how does that get into everyday society?
Yeah. So, some of these schools were more private, right? They might meet in somebody's home. It might be a small community of students and a teacher. But a lot of these schools from the very beginning, I mean, you saw it with Socrates. Socrates was out on the street interviewing people. It was almost like these YouTubers that are like, hey, what do you think? What do you think
if he had a YouTube channel, oh my goodness.
Yeah, and Socrates went around sort of interviewing people about, controversial questions. And the Stoics, they're called Stoics because they got started on the Stoa, that is the colonnade in Athens. And so they taught and listened to their teacher out in the open. And presumably these schools would have been open to listeners, seekers coming in and listening. So that sort of thing would have happened. Eventually, if you were, from an elite family, somebody that's well educated, even if you didn't study philosophy extensively, you would learn sort of the basics of each of the philosophical schools, and you'd be able to intelligently throw some Stoicism into a conversation, or something like that. But there's been some interesting work done, kind of exploring the reach of ancient philosophy, beyond sort of the big names that we know. Right? We know, if you take it in the time of Paul, we have a Stoic named Seneca that is probably the best known of any of the Stoics, and he's left us a lot of writing that we can still read. But when you look at ancient inscriptions, I mean, things that have survived on walls and temples and statues, there are all kinds of names of philosophers. There are people that we otherwise know nothing about, people that haven't left any writings, people that are not referenced in any other sources. And there's a 7-volume dictionary of philosophers that's brought all of this evidence together that contains the names of 3,000 people that identified as philosophers. And there have been a number of studies that have done this sort of thing. But what it shows is that most people in history are just lost to history. We don't hear about them. Only a small piece of history survives. But that philosophers were more ubiquitous than you might think, right? And that might mean some people have learned philosophy by attending lectures in public. Some of them might have absorbed it in more indirect ways. Some of them might just know some very basic principles, but principles that they then tried to live by. So, for example, if you look at epitaphs, ancient graves, we have a lot of graves that actually have philosophical quotations on them that are, very, very modest, graves that might have belonged to a poor person, but that has a philosophical saying that can actually even be identified with the teachings of a particular philosophical school. And so by putting that on your epitaph, in a way, you're saying, something very essential to what I think is a philosophical principle, right? Something that is actually guided my life that I've tried to live by. And so all of that's to say is, there were people that considered philosophy an important part of their identity, whose names we don't know, or whose names we know, but we know nothing else about them. But all of the ways in which philosophy sort of percolated out into society, I mean, many of those were indirect and so forth. And so you mentioned the Areopagus sermon in Acts. Paul comes to Athens and he preaches out in a public space. And there are people listening to him that are passersby or people that are just hanging out. And that's the sort of context in which some people might have become familiar with philosophy. It was sort of the street preachers, they say. Often those were the cynic type philosophers, right? The homeless philosophers that stood on the street corners and reproached you for not living the way that you ought to live, and so on. But at least in Acts account in Athens, there are philosophers who happen to be present that listen to Paul and had some of them positive reactions and some of them negative. And it's interesting there that none of the Epicureans are said to have responded positively to Paul. Although
interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a great picture. There's actually a few things coalesced, I think, for me as well. You referred to Seneca. I guess our primary first century sources for Stoicism are Seneca and Epictetus. And Seneca is, he's a traditional elite senator, scholar that has plenty of time to write and to articulate his ideas. And so he writes philosophical tracts. He writes letters to Lucilius. And so we have, I guess he was a tutor to Nero, so he was a teacher as well. Like he had, so we have sources from him as a Stoic thinker. We know of Epictetus' teaching, but only because his student we've got his students' lecture notes, not so much directly from Epictetus himself, but just what he's picked up in class. And that actually really fits, I guess, with ancient education where you don't, a lecturer doesn't necessarily have pre-written lecture notes that they keep and preserve for later, and they just sort of teach as they go and their students absorb, because philosophy is much more about, it's not just about listen to what I say and memorize what I say, but it's watch what I do and live the way that I do. It's much more about sort of an imitation lifestyle. So it would make sense. And even if they did write stuff down, that there'd be no necessary reason to keep it after the lifetime. So all that to say, we don't have a lot of sources, but it makes sense that there are a lot of teachers back then. I guess in the same way that there's lots of high school, there's lots of university lecturers that you'll never know about. If their lecture materials will die with them, but there's thousands of university lecturers, but some might stand out because they turn it into books, like your Tom Wrights or even yourself. There's books that will live on beyond them. Anyway, so I guess in that sense, yeah, it would make sense that there are thousands of teachers that we'll never hear about, but that were active in what was actually only a very small empire, a few tens of millions of people, really. So they're going to be everywhere, and their teachers are going to get through. But then, as an extension of that, their students will, hopefully live out the teachings and incorporate it to their life, and maybe encourage others who haven't been to school to say, look, you should try living this way. In the same way a Christian might say, what have you tried, some of these Christian virtues? And they go, that seems to work. And maybe they start to embrace those as let's just say like bits and pieces. I mean, you've got Quintilian's probably not the best example, but he'll say, look, don't sign yourself up for one particular philosophical school. Take the best of all of them. I think Plutarch talks about like a bee going to all different flowers and taking pollen from all different and kind of creating your own mix. Just adopt ideas that seem to work and that work in combination with each other, and pursue that way. So again, if you were an everyday person, you would pick these ideas up. I guess one more factor of that spread would be the fact that the Romans so fully embraced Stoicism, because it's so aligned with that militaristic culture of, the ideal Roman general is a Stoic. He's just lost half his men, but it's about winning the battle. It's not about getting emotional over the death of all the men. Like, Stoicism leans into that. It creates a framework for that sort of lifestyle. So I guess the soldiers would adopt a lot of that for their own fighting. I'm going to go out to fight. Well, if I die, well, it's a virtuous death. Like, you could imagine how the context would absorb Stoic ideas as justification for those difficult times. I mean, I guess in a modern society, you might have people talk about karma. Well, they got no idea about Buddhism or Hinduism or anything like that, but they like the idea of karma, that if you treat me badly in the next life, you're going to be a cockroach. I don't know anything about the system that came from, but I like that idea. So in a sense, the ideas do permeate through. Would that be right? Like, or am I way off track here?
No, I think those are all very, very good examples of the indirectness, the superficiality with which these ideas can reach people, for sure. And it would not be in the spirit of what a Seneca or a Zeno would want, right? For them, you have this system that is internally consistent, that all the doctrines are related. So if you change one of the doctrines and substitute another one, it doesn't actually fit with the system. But there were countless people that just weren't purists, right? As you said, they picked things up eclectically. They found some things useful and some things not so useful.
Well, I think you probably would be the same as me, as a New Testament lecturer, very much a purist. Students of Paul would go, no, you can't pick and choose from the different philosophers and incorporate them with Paul. If you're going to take some of Paul, you got to take all of. Like, I guess I could really resonate with a Seneca in that case of, no, it's all or nothing. No, we'll just take the bits that work, and I like that idea. Don't like that idea about Paul, so we'll just leave that. I could resonate with Seneca, is all I'm saying. The more I read the guy, the more I get. I kind of get where you're coming from.
And this is a really important point. I mean, to go back to where we started, each philosophical school said, what is the best kind of human life? So that is, what is the thing that once we've got it, we've said we've achieved the best kind of life? That we call that thing the telos, or the goal, or the end, right? And so by sort of taking things eclectically, right now you're not oriented, single-heartedly towards the one thing, right? you might sort of veer off track as this other philosophical system that has some interesting things sort of takes you in a different direction. Now you're not oriented towards the one good anymore. And I think this is where the philosophical schools in their pure form provide a really good analog to what Christianity is, right? Where arguably, as early as Paul, you can see Paul basically saying, there's one thing that's absolutely good, in all that we do ought to be oriented towards that thing. So Philippians 3 is a good text for this, where essentially he says, all things I consider rubbish except just knowing Christ, in which I will ultimately attain to the resurrection. Right? You can think of that as everything that he does is oriented towards that goal. I mean, that's what Christianity is. So you can't just change pieces if it changes that particular goal. And if you have that particular goal, there's certain things that you do that don't actually lead to it, right? And so having that fixed goal is in the consistency of the sorts of things that we do that lead toward it is really essential if you are to actually live Christianly, or as Paul would consider Christianly, right? Just like
I'm smiling a bit. So I'm smiling a bit. I just finished a series on Philippians, and when I was going through chapter 3, I was drawing a lot of comparisons with Stoicism. So I just feel so vindicated now of you saying that. Like I wasn't just, yeah. So if anyone's listened to the Philippian series and they're listening to this, I was right, and I've just been proven right.
Right.
So thank you very much, Tim. That's
hey, man,
extraordinarily
that's what I'm
helpful.
here for. Yeah.
Let's pick up on that idea. So so with all of that as a cultural context, and I think it's quite clear that we're talking about, it's not a different world to the one we live in, but it's where philosophy is so much more present and so much more sort of obvious in the world around them. How does Christianity fit into that? I know it's a bit of a vague question, but Christianity comes into that world. Paul, okay, let's just use Paul as a better example. He goes into this Greco-Roman world where he's having debates with philosophers. Where are the resonances? We'll get to some of the specifics about Christianity versus Stoicism when we talk about your second book, but just as a general, Christianity overall, where does that, how does that fit sort of into this model, into this world of philosophical ideas and the similarities, etc.? If that's a leading question there.
Yeah. So basically, how is Christianity kind of entering into that intellectual conversation?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, so if you kind of jump forward in time, say after Paul, because I think it just becomes clearer later on. By the time you get to church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen in the 3rd century, but especially by the time you get to St. Augustine around 400, you now have Christians that are very clearly and intentionally engaging Greek philosophy as they essentially present Christianity as a rival philosophy. So it's not now just there's philosophy and Christian missionaries sort of encounter philosophers, and right, they're just kind of they're doing two different things, but they engage each other in some way. By the time you get to the 3rd, 4th century, you have Christians that basically realize philosophy is its main competitor for evangelizing people, so to speak, to the greatest kind of life, the greatest kind of good. And so St. Augustine in the City of God, in book 19, he actually explicitly puts Christianity within this conversation about philosophical schools and the highest good. And he said, here are all the views of the highest good. Here's the Christian view of the highest good. So now he explicitly says Christianity is like philosophy in that it has a thing that we identify as the highest good. It's the thing that all of our actions should be oriented toward. And here's why it's better than the goods that the philosophical schools give us. Right? So by that point, we have very clearly Christianity saying we're a rival philosophy, but we're the one true philosophy. If you back up to Paul, that level of explicit dialogue isn't happening yet. Paul isn't yet kind of intentionally picking up the discourse of philosophers and asking exactly the kinds of very technical questions that philosophers were asking, as Christian theologians would later, as they were basically forced to ask important questions like, well, Paul tells us that Jesus is Lord. In the Gospels, Jesus does things that normal human beings can't do, right? God's redemptive purposes are all accomplished in Christ. But that's different than the Nicene Creed saying, Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father, right? Once you start articulating things in that way, Christian theologians are doing what philosophers are doing. And they say, let's break everything down and make sure that we can explain the nuances of this perfectly. And that's a development over time. Basically, Christian theologians start to talk more philosophically, but they also do it out of necessity, out of competition with philosophy to show that Christianity offers a better way.
And they come to adopt, some of the basic ideas like the cardinal virtues are really sort of baptized as Christian ideas. It's like, well, you guys were right. You just didn't have the full picture of Christ as the conduit for those, or the empowerment for those. And I suppose you've got the church fathers sort of using Aristotelian ways of reasoning to come to some of their own conclusions. I mean, it's quite like you sort of see Philo doing that on the Jewish side of things, talking about Moses being the ideal philosopher and how that, and using sort of Platonic ideas for his own discussion. So they obviously, as you say, they saw themselves as a rival school of philosophy. And so, it's not that you guys are entirely wrong. You've got some good ideas, but let's complete the picture with Christ and sort of paint that whole picture. And it's what you get the opponents too, I guess, don't you? Where I think Kelsis would talk about Jesus as just as a charlatan philosopher, and sort of, because when you look from an outsider's perspective, I use this with my students. I say, look, if you were an outsider looking into a church, and if I could take somebody from the first century and look into one of Paul's church meetings and say to them, well, what is that? They wouldn't say that's a religious group, but they'd say that that's a school. That's a philosophical school, to be precise, because of the way they're talking. Like, they would resonate with that sort of context. But so, okay, that's So Christianity, even if it didn't fully identify itself in Paul's time as a rival philosophy, it was doing the sort of work that the philosophers already were. It was asking the existential questions. And I guess I should make the point that we if you ask somebody today and say, what is Christianity? They say, oh, it's a religion. You would never say that in the first century, because the idea of the gods and the cults are, no, we keep the gods happy. We offer them sacrifices so that they don't destroy our lives. But we don't look to the gods for morality. We don't look to the gods for ethics. Frankly, if we did, our world would be terrible, because the gods are really terrible ethically and morally. We look to the philosophers for how to live the good life. And really, that's what Paul is coming along and saying. It's like, okay, this is the true life. This is the one that's in Christ and all that. So they're doing that sort of work. I guess just kind of the last thing I wanted to talk to you about then was with the new book, with Rediscovering the Wisdom, because early on we start to see those conflicts of ideas, and you've really made this case in your Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians, where you're suggesting that, well, I don't want to tell the story, but the basic point of is to say where some of the confusion and division is happening in Corinth is where you've got people that are coming in with some of these Stoic ideas, and it's resonating with these new Christian ideas, but it's creating problems where it's starting to actually conflict with what Paul is saying and requiring of his people. I'm going to butcher it if I say any more. So tell us about what's the basic premise of the book, and kind of what's your reconstruction of what actually happened in Corinth that led to some of the breakdown.
Yeah, so to try to give the simplest version of it, 1 Corinthians 1-4 introduces a problem in the church. The church is divided. He says, some of you say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. So there seem to be these different factions in the church. But Paul very quickly moves to wisdom, and particularly a wisdom that he calls human wisdom, or the wisdom of the world. And this is a bad kind of wisdom. And it's in contrast to what he calls the wisdom of God, or the wisdom of the cross, or the wisdom of Christ crucified. So in the first 4 chapters, he's developing this antithesis. And the question is, why is he denouncing this wisdom? What is it that the Corinthians think? What is this wisdom that they think they have that he is attempting to correct? And what I argue in the book is that, as you said, it's a brand of Stoicism. It's not Stoicism pure and simple, because these people think that they're Christians, right? They think that they adhere to what Paul has taught them. And so just I refer to their wisdom as sub-Stoicism rather than Stoicism for methodological reasons that I get into in the book. But there were a couple, I think, points of overlap between what they knew from Stoicism and what they heard from Paul that became a kind of starting point for their developing this kind of sub-Stoicism out of Paul's teaching. And one of those is the idea of an indwelling spirit, which in Greek is pneuma. We didn't talk exactly about that point, but we talked about in Stoicism the logos that infuses all things. So it's the logos when conceived in terms of its intelligence, because it's an intelligent or rational thing. But it's pneuma or spirit when conceived in terms of its material. Pneuma is basically this airy, fiery blend, but that is the form that God takes. God is actually matter. But in Stoicism, pneuma fills everything, and it's pneuma ultimately that gives you the capacity to reason. So
just on a point, I just sorry to cut you off. Yeah. So just Stoicism is a pantheistic belief. The God is in, right. And there's really just one God, but he's not a personal God like the God of Judaism or Christianity, but he permeates, controls, holds together, drives everything. So it's sort of pantheistic in that way. So the logos or the theos, the pneuma are all one and the same thing, that are in and through everything, but it's not, you can't relate to that God in the same way that Paul would talk about the Christian God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Pantheistic is precisely what it was. But since Paul also talked about a pneuma or a spirit that indwells us, right? There's an obvious difference that Paul isn't saying that spirit indwells everything in nature in the same way, right? He'd say that those who are in Christ, those who put faith in Christ, have the Spirit. But the Corinthians, for whatever reason, are hearing, the indwelling spirit, it's like Stoic spirit. It gives you the capacity to reason, to know, to be wise. I think a second point of common ground they found with Stoicism is that, well, Paul talked about Jesus as essentially the perfect human being, right? Not just a human being, but the human being as the human ought to be, perfected. And all of the philosophical schools had this sort of idea that, well, human can be perfected, right? Nature has designed us and equipped us with the resources we need to fulfill what a human ought to be. And the human being that did this, they refer to as the wise man, like this quintessential human being. That in a way was a divine figure because the human being used his divinely given resources, right? But those resources now become intrinsic to what we are. So if I have reason, it's not like I'm using God's reason to become perfect. It's I have reason. Part of what it is to be a human is to have it as part of me. So now I can use those resources to fulfill, what it means to be a human. And so the Corinthians may have been hearing this too, is Jesus is like the wise man, right? And Paul is talking about how human beings can become what they ought to be in Christ when they receive the Spirit. And so there were, without getting into the technicalities, there were some differences, obviously, between what these Corinthians believed and what the Stoics believe. This is why it's sub-Stoicism. But they think that essentially they're adhering to what Paul had taught. And so one other thing that we talked about earlier was philosophical schools is basically taking place in somebody's home, where you would have a teacher and then you would have a little philosophical community that would learn from him there. And as many people know, in Paul's letters we see reference to house churches very often, and it looks like that's the primary form that these Pauline assemblies took. In the book of Acts, when he's in Corinth, after he gets ejected from the synagogue, there's a guy named Titius Justus who has a home, and then he takes Paul into the home, and that seems to have become Paul's kind of new base during his time in Corinth. And so I speculate that, this is something too that helped foster in some of these Corinthians the idea that basically what they were was a philosophical school. Paul was their teacher. He'd kind of founded a new school, but they've refracted that through kind of a Stoic framework, based on some common ideas that they found. And what this leads to then is it's not everybody in Corinth that's taken this view. There are some that call themselves wise men, and that think of themselves as perfect, as a Stoic wise man was perfect. But they look at others in the community as not having attained this status. They're not fully wise, and they're immature, and they're unspiritual. And so they've created this two-tiered kind of view of their Christian community. And this is, in large part, what Paul sees wrong with their wisdom. What makes it a human wisdom is that those tiers create comparisons. It says, I'm better than you. I'm more important than you. I've achieved something that you haven't achieved. And it celebrates that separation, right? Where Paul says, no, that's not the wisdom of the cross. The wisdom of the cross was somebody who lowered himself voluntarily, somebody that gave up his own interest in order to help other people. And this is all embodied in the cross, in Christ crucified. That's simply a symbol for a way of life that gives up one's own interests for other people. And so where the Corinthians' wisdom basically said, I embrace comparison. I embrace being better than other people, having a higher status than other people. Paul responds to that with God's wisdom that's best embodied in Jesus.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I've read the book. I loved it. It was a very convincing case that you make. It's getting close to dinner time over where you are, so I'll let you get back to the rest of your evening, but I cannot thank you enough. Just one more time, just show us, so the two books that we've really sort of talked around, you two most recent have been, just want to, if you can show those again, and I'll put the links to them in the description, but so that's the one we just talked about, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians. So that's definitely the more technical monographs, sure. That's come out with Edmonds.
This is the one that's just come out this week, Greek and Roman Philosophy, an introduction for students of the New Testament. So it's written with students of the New Testament in mind, as that suggests. Basically, it opens by saying, look, here in modern scholarship, we've been thinking about the way in which the New Testament engages philosophy. So I start with kind of a history of that conversation in modern scholarship. The rest of it is more or less a chronological walk through the history of Greek philosophy from the pre-Socratics in the 6th century BC to the development of Neoplatonism in the 3rd century AD. With a final appendix that's an annotated bibliography on studies in New Testament studies that look at the New Testament vis-a-vis Greek philosophy. Brilliant.
And I think what I liked about it too is you've really just you've really just dealt with the primary sources. It's not, you're not really just stopping at the secondary sources about a particular school. You're going back to the primary sources. So even just as if you really want to go deeper into it, it's a great resource, I think, just to know where to look. You pick up the low-ebb classical libraries, like where do you begin to understand these philosophical schools, because they're sort of scattered throughout all the sources, but you've really drawn them together as well. So exactly, you can either read all of those books or just read Tim's book, and you're just going to get all of that summarized to the stuff that you actually are going to be more interested to read about. So it's an exceptionally good book. I'll put the links to those in the description, and that'd be fantastic. But anyway, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Hopefully we get to chat to you another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dr.
Fantastic.
White.
All right. Thanks, mate. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.